It's time for our panel. So I'd invite those in our panel up to the stage. So Ashley Francis, the co-founder and CEO of FemDX. Do you want to come on up? And we'll go ahead and get started here in just a moment. Derek Hillstrom, the Vice President of Engineering and Quality from Bone Health, and Chester Burris, the Director of Business Development and Senior Systems Engineer at Valentium. Joanna wasn't able to be with us. I think that's. Thank you. Let me give you a mic. So just to kind of set the stage, earlier this year, we interviewed, as I mentioned, 613 medtech professionals to ask them what the challenges they were facing for 2023. And we got a lot of responses back. One of the things that, we'll get into what all specifics in just a moment, but that is kind of what we wanted to talk about a little bit today. What is the state of medtech, and how are companies, the best-in-class companies, approaching these different challenges? So there's obviously a variety of technical talent, a variety of all kinds of talent here, a lot of years behind it. So I'm really excited to get to talk to you guys today. One of the things that we learned from our study is that 40% of medtech professionals they don't feel confident in the regulations. They don't feel confident they can be compliant. And that is one of the top focuses for companies in 2023 is to become compliant. So I'm curious, you've seen a lot of, and I'm just talk to you for a moment, Chester. Over the years, you've seen a lot of changes in how companies approach compliance. How do you see the best-in-class companies approaching compliance, maybe even from a cultural standpoint, to really drive quality across the organization to really produce a quality company and quality devices? What are your thoughts? Do you have any recommendations, advice?
Yeah, I think I do. So I think the mistake may be a harsh word, but I think you don't know what you don't know, per se, especially when you're getting started in a smaller company space. And so it's important to really have a system in place that is compliant with the guidelines, because that basically protects humans from making the mistakes of oversight and such. And of course, in the past, it was paper systems that were quite laborious. I set up a couple of them, right? The beauty of moving on with technology and getting to an EQMS type space is that you're not allowed to make those human errors. You just can't, because your system is robust. So having a third-party vetted, or prior validated system, I think is huge, and will prevent folks from making those mistakes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Derek, what about you in the relationships that you've seen across, cross-functionally? What are some mistakes, challenges that you see companies getting into, and maybe, obstacles to avoid?
So I personally think a lot of the issues with compliance ends up being self-inflicted. And it's because you try to fit the same round peg into a square hole for every company. And every company has a different risk profile for their products. I've worked on an implantable that needed to be in a clean room. And that's got a completely different risk profile from a wearable device that's going to have a connected app with it. And so trying to bring over your quality system expertise from a Medtronic and make it work for a new product ends up creating more headaches than it helps. And so that inertia of getting over like the paper-based systems, or, this is the way I've done it in the past and that worked for me then, that's really your top hurdle. So creating systems that are scalable and that can fluctuate from what you would need if you're at a class 1 device versus what you would need at a class 3 device is really is the way to make sure that you don't run into those problems later on. When you make your development team have to work with overly restrictive or overly cumbersome systems, you end up they stop doing it. Then your quality team gets ticked off because nobody's following the processes. Then your development team's ticked off, and pretty soon you've just got everybody a little bit upset at each other. So,
yeah, I want to kind of mention one thing that you or I guess emphasize something that you said. So, I didn't really give my background. So, my previous role was I was a project management professional for a drug delivery combination product, and so I managed a very wide ranging team. And you mentioned something about our self-inflicted things, and that is. There's a lot of work that goes on for work's sake, unfortunately, and it's kind of showing up in tech a little bit. But that work for work's sake, sometimes we use that as an excuse. Maybe the documentation that we hide behind, or chasing down paperwork. So those are interesting points. The self-inflicted side. So I just kind of emphasize that. Ashley, you kind of have a different perspective. You come from the VC side of things, and then became a CEO of a medical device company. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your foray into this and how that. I don't know what your experience was prior. Maybe I missed that, but how you see compliance and quality and driving that culture of quality across your organization. What are your thoughts when it comes to leading a team like that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenge thing, the R&D team and the quality team, usually they don't get along very well. So I try my best to balance the teams. And also one thing about how to manage the team and talking about the compliance, I think the easiest way is we just follow the SOP. We just do what we said in the SOP and do not set up the traps for yourself in the SOP. And I think a green light is a very good system, can combine everything together.
That SOP mention, that's interesting. These are rules that we don't always obey, but it's interesting because we're the ones who write those rules. The company is the one who should be writing those. So if we're not able to obey those, we should really rewrite them. So it's a really good point that you bring up. Okay, and I wanted to ask you another question too, Ashley. You're one of the locals on stage, and I am not. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or advice for companies who may be starting out here in the Bay Area, whether from a funding perspective, building a team perspective, or just shoring up gaps in knowledge. Any advice from a local standpoint?
Yeah, in the Bay Area, in the environment of VC and startup company, I like the environment here. So I think one thing from a VC perspective, so when people try to do the pitching for the investor, they always focus on the technologies as well as the financial projections. But I think one thing is very important is your teams, working with your team as a family. That's very important because some VC or investors, not only they want to know your technology, they also want to make sure you're a decent person. If they like you, they will keep talking to you. So that's very important. And the second thing is I think the VC, they like to focus on the milestone more than financial projections. Some team, they will show in the presentation that, in 5 years, this is my numbers, this is the financial projections. But everybody knows those are made up numbers. So I think they still prefer to see the 1 year milestone, after 1 year or 2 years, we'll have a design freeze. And the third years, we are probably going to submit the FDA. So those milestones, they're more important than the financial projections, made up numbers.
And I want to come back to that in just a moment, but it's a good segue into the next question that I had, which is time to market versus expectations. We had an expectation that, not sure why it suddenly got dark, but the expectation, as a project manager, you may say, okay, on December 3rd, 2028, we're going to have our design transfer fully done and all these different things. So, and those, obviously, you just mentioned that they move around. Well, when we did this study, it turns out, I think it was 60% of companies miss that mark. They're not able to estimate accurately the time to market. So the question I maybe have for you, and maybe actually I'll start with Chester, but I do want to get back to you because I want to know your thought on this too. But Chester, when a company isn't able to make those projections, what is the consequence in that company, and how can you overcome that? What are your thoughts when it comes to timeline, time to market, and expectations?
Yeah, so the consequences can be dire, especially in the sort of VC space, right? If they don't have faith in you, the money runs out, and then you go home. There's not a lot left to do. You've got to basically manage, as close as possible. In the commercial space, I mean, it can be equally as detrimental because you have everybody else's money in the stock market riding on your success and meeting your milestones. So it can be extremely detrimental. That's whenever professionals get fired and you see them moving on to other companies. You didn't ask this specifically, but part of it is how do you avoid those situations? And normally you miss deadlines, not because you're not working hard or what have you, but there's often reiterations of effort that you've either already done or intended to do or you missed. And I'm a process guy, whether it's engineering or manufacturing and what have you. So if you have a detailed process to get to the space of whatever that deliverable is, then you can march towards it and hold each other accountable to get there. If you don't have a process, then you can miss certain steps or do them incorrectly, and you wind up reiterating, and then you just blow through your time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Derek, I'm curious what your thoughts are. You mentioned the step 1 through 20, you're step 4 through 20 guy. And when I think about that, I'm like, okay, well, there's multiple points of failure then, and each one has a tolerance band. So if I do a tolerance stack up on my timeline, who knows? So what are your thoughts? How do you overcome or prevent those challenges?
I mean, early stage product development is messy. You're not going to accurately predict it other than, you've got the graph in your chart, so I suppose you just use those numbers, and you're probably going to be closer to correct most of the time. For me, though, she had mentioned milestones. I call them inflection points. It's where you're going to gain value in your company, and focusing on those, right? Your 5-year projections are going to be wrong, but you can focus on the inflection points. When am I going to get first in animal? When am I going to get first in man? When am I going to get submission? And so by boiling down to the inflection points where you're going to see real steep increases in value at the company, you can keep people from focusing on something that won't be important until you get to that point anyways. You have to get through steps 4 through 7 to start step 8. And so that's, for me, it's break it down into small chunks. Keep reevaluating. Every 3 months, go back and make sure, am I still on track for what I had said that I was going to do?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Ashley, how does that conversation go with investors or top management when those milestones maybe aren't hit? And what can people do to, mitigate the damage when those conversations go a little bit sideways? What are your pieces of advice there?
Yeah, I think for a VC perspective, so I always do like under promise but over deliver. That's very important. That's how you talk to the investor. Try to give them surprise, but do not over promise. But only also for the operational perspective, I think for my company, we try to do everything in-house. In that way, we can control everything. But once you give it to the third party or some other engineering company, if they couldn't deliver it on time, that's a disaster. But Valentium is always delivered on time. I'm talking about another engineering company. Yeah.
I didn't know you knew Valentium. Okay. No, that's cool.
Just do that in-house.
Fantastic. That makes sense. Well, you mentioned manufacturing, so I'm curious everybody's thoughts on that as well. So scaling manufacturing, that was another issue that a lot of companies were facing issues with in our report, and that was scaling their manufacturability or manufacturing, training people at the manufacturing facility, as well as feedback loops and maintaining those feedback loops between manufacturing, product development, and quality. So I don't know if you want to just pick one of those, but what I'd love to hear is any advice on how we can make those things better, or whether it's scaling that manufacturing and avoiding any pitfalls, or any of those different points. Chester, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think it comes down to transparency and feedback, constant feedback between the groups. the manufacturing feeds design inputs. Design inputs, feed design outputs, which feeds it just goes on and on and on. So the having the ability to, and again, it comes down to analyzing frequently. There are management reviews for all you guys out there who are compliant, right? The compliance is once a year type of thing. What's supposed to be scheduled, most people do once a year. Having more frequent reviews matter, and having the right people who can make the right decisions, basically feed each other, matters. And the downside to not doing that is exactly what you're saying. You lack the scalability, and you could actually miss the market demand and not be able to react to it on both the developmental and the manufacturing side.
Yeah. What do you think, Derek? Do you have any thoughts?
So I've never been lucky enough where I've been blessed with so much money that I could appropriately scale manufacturing. I'm sure there are companies out there that are like that, and if you're looking for somebody to help you scale, I'd love to work for you. I mean, like I said, it's a messy process. To truly scale, you would need to generally prepare 12 to 18 months ahead of time, which is going to be before you submit, which is going to be before an inflection point where you can actually raise the money that oftentimes gets you to manufacturing. I think the only way to do that is to try to really get through it. Well, there's two ways. One is make sure that the people that you have on your team are passionate, smart people who care about what you're trying to accomplish, because they're going to be willing to kind of fight through all of those bumps that you go through on the way. But the other is to try to get into a step-wise scaling where it's easy to stagger from one to the other. And so while doing stuff in-house can help you, but you're eventually probably going to be with a contract manufacturer somewhere. So there are companies like Valentium that can help you kind of do that transition between, okay, I've done the first 100 parts here in-house. I'm not going to be able to build 1,000 here without investing a lot of capital into it, and I don't want to give it away to a contract manufacturer who may take too long, and I'm not going to have as much control over quality. So I need to find places that can give me kind of a hybrid approach in the middle, even sometimes using companies that might have offshore capabilities, but also have onshore capabilities so that you can be working closer to the teams that are actually building your product. But at the end of the day, unless you're going to be able to invest the money 12 to 18 months ahead of time, some of it, they're just going to be hurdles that you're going to have to overcome.
So you made me think of another question that I didn't let you guys know about. So I'm just curious about something. I'd be curious if each of you have a favorite failure story in regards to timeline or something along those lines. I can remember one for me, and I'll share it if I have to. But do you have a favorite failure story where you didn't meet a timeline, or maybe the team didn't, and how you guys worked through the aftermath? Anything come to mind? If not, it's okay. We can move on. But anybody want to volunteer?
So, it's a rather expensive story. Basically, there was a scenario, and I can't use a whole lot of names, but there was a submission deadline based on a round of funding. At the time, that was only in the couple of $1 million, right? That we were on a particular burn rate for, and so we bid off the assignment of doing MRI assessments, evaluations with a specific deadline. And in this particular instance, there was missed testing and improperly performed testing that was done. And so then that basically made the decision, okay, are we going to submit sort of at risk? It's close enough. We think we can justify it. Or are we going to proactively go ahead and do this work? With the funding in play, right, is like we convinced ourselves that we could justify it and go ahead and submit, and we had answers ready and all of that. We thought the answers were sufficient, right? The notified body did not, and so it basically resulted in about a $750,000 sort of hit that we didn't have, that we had to go and ask for more money for. Luckily, our product at the time was attractive enough, and we had friendly enough investment money that they supported us, but that was a rather expensive and painful, not a favorite memory per se, but something that, again, if we had the proper, I think, people involved, one, and two, the process involved, we may have avoided that.
It's a good point. You know, when I use the word favorite failure, maybe that's not an accurate, word, but when you go through those negative experiences, it's as if the resolution on your memory goes up. The frame rate is so high, you remember every detail, and so it's always interesting for me to hear those stories. Ashley, you started to volunteer. Do you have a story?
Yeah, it's kind of like a bad experience. I remember it's like we use another engineering company, and once we got a protocol and asked them to approve that. So I think that was on Monday, and they sent it back. So I said, hey, there's a red line. Please correct that. And we correct that, send it back. On Tuesday, there's another red line again. So we fix it again, and on the third day, they send us back the documents again, the Word document. There's another red line we need to correct. And I thought, why not just correct everything in one day? And finally, until like a Thursday, I said, okay, I think today we can sign the protocol. Everything's ready to go. And I wouldn't mention the name, and the lady is in charge for the documentation. She just said, oh, I can only review that next Monday. So I've been waiting for a long time. And on Thursday, she told me, okay, on Friday, I have another plan I have to review for another client. So you got to wait until next week. So for timing and for the team, so we just waiting for the small like grammar change. So that's kind of like a bad experience for me.
Yeah, I can identify with that, and I totally understand that story. I appreciate you sharing. Derek, what are your thoughts? You got a pass?
I try not to think about my failures, especially as favorites.
Okay, that's fine. I'll stand in for you this time then. I had a situation once where we had to deliver so many parts of product, and I'm kind of similar. I have to kind of shade it a little bit, but we weren't going to meet that deadline because one of the components came in, was going to have to be 100% inspected. Well, as the project manager, and also due to some other qualifications, I was able to assist in that. So I stayed late. I was so proud of myself. I stayed till 8 or 9 o'clock that night, assisted in this. The next day, I had to tell, we got it out the door the next morning. The next day, I had to tell the VP of engineering, what had happened. And he said, and you were on the line helping? I said, yeah. He said, well, remind me to pay you less. and it was a good experience in that, sometimes we think we're doing the right thing, but in reality, we should have delegated better earlier on in the process, things like that. So there's interesting things that you can learn, all those different things. Let's go back to our original topic then. So in the report, we talked about shifting the mindset from compliance to quality. That was one of the questions that we had, and it's more of a cultural company thing that's specific to medical devices. You have to have, whether it's a quality system, we assume that you're going to have a quality product. But in reality, a lot of companies are really just focusing on a compliant product. And so I'm curious if you have any stories or pieces of advice for companies who would like to shift from that mindset of just compliance, meeting the basic minimum requirement, to more of a quality-focused culture within the entire organization. And maybe we can start with Derek. Would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, again, the biggest step between compliance and quality is making sure that you're going back to the regulations and then fitting it for your company. And again, there's just such a wide variety of medical device companies. I mean, they're software as a medical device. There's implantables, there's wearables now. And so trying to one size fits all the quality for each of those products has a different risk profile. And the biggest trick, compliance is really a fairly straightforward thing. The FDA just says you need to have a process and you need to show that you're following that process. It really is up to each individual company to create that process and create it in a way that's going to be followed and is going to translate into quality on your device itself. So I think making sure that you understand the regulations, you don't want to get out of compliance, but then focusing it to using your experience to fine-tune those processes to make sure that you're setting up forms and systems that actually can be followed by your engineers and your manufacturing and your quality people. If you have to click NA on 10 inputs on a form multiple times throughout the product life, then that form's a little bit overly cumbersome. Like, just fix it. That's I think, in order to make sure that you're focused on quality, barrel it down to the quality aspects you care about with the type of product you're working on.
Great advice. Appreciate it. Ashley, what about you?
I agree with Derek.
Okay. All right. Chester, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we would all agree with Derek on that. I'll touch it from a different angle, and that's from the human perspective, right? Each company has a quality policy. At least if you're a medical device company, you're required to, right? But then, are you living that quality policy? And if you've been in the medical device industry for any amount of time, you're not in it necessarily to just have the job, right? Because there's a lot you have to do that's painful. You really wind up being into it because you have an innate drive to affect the quality of life of those people who basically have no other option or, basically need, assistance in order to live the type of life that, we all want to live. For example, you think of it in the lines of, it may be your wife or husband who has a stroke, right? It could be your child who winds up having to need a heart pump type of thing, or, someone you care about has a diabetes pump that has to keep them alive. When you start thinking of in that nature, then it really hits home, right? And if you guys are leaders in your medical device companies, one thing that's extremely powerful is to have the patient population represented within your company, at events or things of that nature. A story that I had gone through once that really hit me was it was one of the very first LVAD implants. It was being done in Paris at the time. Traveled over there, supported the surgery, all that, was excited. I felt real good about myself. But whenever the next morning, the wife of this, he was in his 40s actually, who had the device, came to visit and basically was completely broken down, emotional, and crying because there was actually color in her husband's face again. So quality has, there of course is the compliance side, and you covered it very well, Derek. The human side is where I think we can all invest in.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, and it makes me think of another question. So quality, the ISO, whether it's ISO 1345 or Part 820, whatever you're trying to build your quality system on, a lot of, one of my favorite questions to ask different people is, what do you think is the most important part of a quality system? And I'll just kind of ask this as a trick question to you guys. And really it's not a trick question. It's your favorite. What do you think is the most important part of a quality management system? If we just kind of get opinion real quickly. Ashley, do you think is there a part that you feel like is the most important?
I think the important part is try to make the quality system easier.
I like it.
I don't like the complex things in the quality system, repeating and fighting between quality engineer and R&D engineers.
Right. Derek, what about you?
Having had to sit through quite a few audits in my career, I would say easy accessibility to the data. Like the auditor is going to say, I want to look at that NCR. You're going to have to find it, and then they're going to trace back to, well, can you bring me the traveler for that lot? And there have been way too many audits with paper-based companies where we got the NCR, we got the lot traveler, and then it's, oh, can you show me the receiving inspection for that part? And all of a sudden, nobody can find the receiving inspection for that lot. And we don't even know whose signature it was on there from 5 years ago. So having easy accessibility to your data so that when the auditor says, I'd like to look at this CAPA, and then they want to start tracing down further in the process, you've got it right there at your fingertips.
Chester, what about you?
I'd say similar. My favorite thing is, at least one's done correctly, is simplicity without elaboration and easy to identify and trace evidence.
Yeah, those are great answers. I love it. To me, when I think about a quality management system, like what is the most important part of it? I used to think it was the CAPA system. CAPA is the heart of the quality management system. But anymore, and to all your points, I agree. Anymore, I really think management responsibility is one of the most important parts of a quality management system, because if you don't have management on board, you're not going to have quality at the bottom of the pyramid. And the reason for that is you may have people who want quality, but they're going to be incentivized in other ways. If every quarter all we talk about is the numbers that we hit, and we're not talking about quality except for when we have to, then that translates down the line. So really, any leader, I highly recommend considering your role in the management responsibility and driving a culture of quality. You already touched on this a little bit, because one of the questions I wanted to ask was, what would make your life easier as a medtech professional? And whether you kind of go any direction you want with this, maybe let's take it into the context of 2023. When you think about 2023, what are the challenges you think you're going to be facing? Or you work with a lot of medical device companies. What specific challenges do you believe medical device companies will face in 2023? And then we can maybe talk about how we can overcome those. But Chester, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So with COVID coming on, and actually before that, there were a lot of virtual medical device companies basically popping up. I was in one of those years ago before it was a thing. And I think that the challenge for those groups in that space is having the ability to identify folks who can help you out. And not to take away from what I was saying there, but I think that finding, sometimes you're forced to find third-party resources to do the job for you. So finding trusted partners that can guide you in this space, whether it's from the quality system implementation, some folks out here that we know, whether it's from, DHF track, whatever the case may be, or CDMO space, like me, finding someone that you can trust and actually work with throughout the entire process, I think is the biggest challenge. And just recently in the last couple of years, it's getting adopted more, even into regulations. But I think that having visibility to a slew of partners, which things like this help, is probably the biggest challenge.
Yeah, I love that. Derek, what about you?
So for us personally, we submitted our de novo application in February. So we're preparing for product launch later this year. And so what I'm most concerned about, and the thing that I would like to, would make my life easier, is training management. We're going to need to start hiring people, making sure that it's a system where it's easy for them to get on board, to understand the systems. I don't think the read and understood method of training management really works, and it just causes more issues and headaches later down the road. You talk about your favorite failures. I mean, oftentimes the favorite failures are things that you could have solved 6 months ago, but you didn't because it wasn't easy or wasn't opportunistic at that time. And then 6 months later, you look and go, probably should have spent more time on training, for instance.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Because read and understand to me, I am totally with you. Every medical device company I've been at, it's tradition to break the spirit of the new hire by putting 40 SOPs on their desk for the first 3 weeks to read and understand. And that poor soul, that's tradition, I believe, in the med tech industry, unfortunately. What do you see as maybe, if you could have a magic wand, how would you fix that?
Well, so the way I like to train, and from especially my time in manufacturing when I was training operators, new operators, is the 3-step process of I'm going to show you how to do it. I'm going to then let you do it while I tell you what you're supposed to do, and then I'm going to let you do it on your own. And if by the 3rd time they can do it on their own and you're not having to correct them, then they're trained. And so it's the same thing, throwing that stack of SOPs, especially when they haven't even seen an NCR form or they haven't even dealt with what your product is yet. So they're just not going to understand it. And then it goes into their long-term memory bank, and you hope that some of it is remembered the first time they need to create an NCR for your product. So actually stepping them through that, you're going through any process that you're going through, have them be watching you go through the process or watching somebody go through the process so that by the end of the time, they can do it on their own and you're not having to constantly correct everything that they've done.
Love that. That makes sense. Ashley, what about you? What are some challenges that you see in 2023?
So currently we are preparing our second 510K to the FDA, but I think how to make life easier, I think a good regulatory consultant is very important. So, like people say, like a good criminal attorney can teach you how to get away from murder, but I think a good regulatory consultant sometimes he or she would tell you how to get away from clinicals, like my consultant, like a regulatory consultant, she tried to argue with the FDA, tried to do the justifications, said, oh, can we do the like cadaver instead of clinicals? Can we do like a little bit lower sample size? So that really helps a lot to make things easier.
Fantastic. I'm curious how you vet out and find the people that you work with. Do you have any process or thoughts that you want to add about that or building that team?
Yeah, I think for a regulatory consultant, first when you talk to her, make sure not only the person is capable to do the work, but also focus on their own personalities. Make sure like this person is not like a stubborn, gotta make the consultant sometimes would tell you, okay, you have to do this. Even FDA said it's optional, but you still have to do it no matter what. That's my nightmare. But if some other people, if they're flexible, said, okay, at least we could give a try to have a pre-sub meeting. We prepare a proposal to the FDA to see what they think. If everything's flexible, that's fine because we have nothing to lose. We just talk with the FDA in our pre-sub meeting. If they say yes, that's good. If they say no, we have another plan.
Yeah, I love that. I think all three of you mentioned the vague nature of the regulations to a certain degree, at least alluded to it. There's an example I use. I'm curious what you guys think about this. So when you go around a curve, you usually see that 45 miles per hour zone or whatever. The FDA would never put 45 miles per hour up. What they would say is it's a 15-degree curve with a certain coefficient of friction, with this wind speed and this, that, and the other, all the details. And then you look at that and you'd say, okay, well, I'm driving a semi, so I'm going to do a back calculation. I can go 15 miles an hour. Or if you were like me when I was 17 with my CBR 929, I knew I could double that speed limit sign, because based on a calculation that you're doing in your brain on the fly. And that's what they do. And so I'm curious, you mentioned those are the regulations. So we write our SOPs and we're just going to do exactly what they say, when in reality, you know your device better than anybody. And as a regulatory person, you should be able to make those arguments with the FDA and they'll respect you if you truly are trying to do the right thing and have quality device. So I respect that. I really, really appreciate that answer. Any other things that you see medical device companies doing, whether if you're working for multiple or if you yourself, I really liked the training example. I love that example. But anything else like that? Any other pieces of actionable advice you could give to medtech companies as they move forward this year? Chester, maybe we'll start with you. Or
Kyle actually touched on this. I don't see him. I don't know where he's at. Right. Oh, there he is. Yeah, you were hidden. Okay. I think that in general, be ahead of whenever certain guidance or regulation is going to kick in. I think it's very important not to wait for the last minute. Like maybe the compliance will be put off, or maybe it'll be put off. Maybe it'll put off. My submission will get in there in time. That is frowned upon a bit, right? So in particular, cybersecurity, for example, that was already to have been applied. It has been pushed off a few months. So I've already gotten feedback from some of our potential clients that, well, do I really have to look into those other 30, recommendations that are in the cybersecurity space now? The answer is yes. You need to, because you are going to be held to it. Because you can be 180 days out before one round of questions and another, and then next thing you know, the compliance is applied. So, well, now you got to go back and do what you should have done from the beginning. So that's one example. I would say that if just across the board, if whatever is pending, make sure you stay out in front of it.
That's a great point, because I think when I think about the things that are coming potentially this year, the end of EUA, maybe QMSR, I don't know exactly, the harmonization with 1345, and like you said, the cybersecurity. If you don't know about that, I'm actually doing a live podcast with Chris Gates from Valentium, and as well as a few others, Medtronic and Boston Scientific, top medical device cybersecurity experts in the world, really, in a few weeks. So if you don't know about that, that's going to be a free virtual event. So, yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate that. Stay ahead of the guidance. What about you, Derek?
So mine's going to be more of a request than anything else. If a certain forward-looking quality management system company, software company for instance, the FDA has their eStars system, and it's fairly straightforward. Put your packaging information here. Put your labeling information here. Put your EMC information here. Really what would be helpful is if there was a system that could basically take your documentation that you've already got in a quality management system, and you're just clicking a box. This is going to be the document that matches up with my packaging specs. This is the document that is my EMC test report. This is, and just go one by one. And while that might be a little bit difficult, it would help the medical device community not have to always be on top of, did this new rule, EMC is my IEC 60601-1-2 that got released a couple of years ago, did that go into effect on January 1st this year, or is it January 1st next year? And having a system that could basically, you need a test report that is compliant to at least edition 3.1 of whatever, and to be easily able to connect it. And that way any changes I make to the test report are automatically ready to go. So later when I'm ready to make my submission, it'll be fast and easy. I know that I've checked off all the boxes in my submissions. Just hint, hint.
I love that. If anybody here is, can give him an API to the FDA, I think that would be helpful to the industry. This is fantastic. I love that. What about you, Ashley?
I think they already answered the question.
Why don't we ask the audience what questions they have? What questions do you have to our panel? Anyone out there with a question? Yeah, David.
I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about the importance of supplier controls, because that can be an opportunity, or it could be.
The importance of supplier controls, yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. It's for, again, I'll go back to the virtual company model, right? The show of supplier control. You're not going to get even a 13485 cert if you don't show proper control of your suppliers. It's huge. And just some advice there. The best way to navigate that is a very strong supplier quality agreement where you go through the CFRs as well as 1345, and you define very specifically what you're responsible for as an entity, and then what your supplier is responsible for. And then when you go and audit or hire an external auditor to go and audit your suppliers, then they find the evidence and such that shows that they can do each one of those items that you're holding them responsible for. And then you have to get the feedback from them that they're actually operating toward it. So supplier control can break you as a medical device company.
Derek? Oh, yeah, go for it.
Can I ask you about when our company's been audited by just contract auditors, what I find is that they usually actually don't have any expertise in our industry at all. So they're just going to ask the same questions that they'd ask to any supplier, and I don't really feel like they're giving good feedback to our customers. So have you had good success with just contract auditors?
Not necessarily. I'll go to Ashley's prime point that she made earlier about identifying the right team, right? It has to do with properly vetting folks, knowing what you need in order to get that done. And basically, you can actually do dry runs with them and have them check things out internally and such, or to show, for them to show you evidence of what they've done in the past. But you're right. There are those out there that can't do the job or do it improperly. It does sort of fall back on really identifying that third source to do it for you.
I was going to, it kind of touches both of those, but go back to the previous question in terms of supplier controls, and similar to making sure your quality system isn't too cumbersome for your team, don't make your specifications too cumbersome for your suppliers. I'm a huge proponent of risk-based controls in your company. You've already spent all of that time creating your risk management file, which tells you exactly what things you're worried about and what risk control measures you've got in there. So if you need a material cert for something, make sure that that's in there. If you don't need a material cert for that product because it's not a risk control measure, making them have to constantly keep their material certs, or oftentimes, like in mechanical systems, having to sit there and do unnecessary inspections of various components or parts. If it's not important to the product, don't force your suppliers to have to keep doing that work over and over again, because, again, it's the same thing as if your quality system is too cumbersome. They're going to stop doing it, or they're going to figure out ways not to do it the way that you need it done, and they're not going to necessarily know which ones are the important ones that they can skip and which ones are the non-important ones that they can skip and the important ones that you need to have happen.
Yes.
Production scale, whether from R&D to commercial or from an internal company's operations to a CDMO, then the critical step to cross is the technology transfer. And that's always kind of tricky. I wonder if you've had systems in the past that succeeded to make technology transfer effective.
Good question. Anyone want to go for it, Jess?
Yeah, sure. So system, unfortunately, was mainly manual, right, and very cumbersome and such. But I do believe that some of that can be sort of automated. It has to do with your product development procedure and the requirements, proof of evidence. And I agree that most of that is risk-driven. With respect to what actually needs to be validated, what can be verified, things of that nature with the transfer itself. So the importance of planning ahead of time with respect to risk mitigations, what actually you have to do process-wise plays an important part in that. So I don't know of an automated system necessarily that does it, other than just being very diligent in making sure everything's covered.
Although the new software systems are getting better at the ability to bring in users from outside of your company and being able to control what they have access to. I mean, the company that might be hosting this might do that fairly well. And so that kind of aids it in, again, if you're not using manual paper-based systems for what you're doing, you can have it so that they have access to whatever the latest version of your MPI is, and that's the same one that they're working off of as the one that you're looking at in your QMS system. So I think there are ways to do it. Whenever my products have been complex, we've kept as much of that in-house as possible. So I don't know how to make it work really well in a complex product. The easier products that I've had, those are the ones that we've transferred outside, and it has generally gone smoothly enough for us. But I would say having systems that allow your entire supply chain to be able to see whatever the latest version is that you need everybody to be working on really will benefit, making sure that there aren't mistakes as to he's working off of Rev B, they're working off of Rev C, and I'm already on Rev D trying to figure out why nothing's matching up.
Good answer. And your previous answer, I think, was really helpful too with that technology transfer, truly understanding the critical to quality points. And, whether, even if you're doing that internally, whether you're going from a manual assembly process to an automated assembly process, knowing which parts of that component are critical will help with that technology transfer, honestly, in my experience. Any other questions from the audience? Yes. Yeah, as a software as a medical device. Yeah.
So I think for FDA, if you already filed that your product is cleared, once you want to change the software or any design change, it's better have a pre-sub meeting with them, because some of the change you can do a letter to file, right? And some of them, they would say, oh, no, you cannot do letter to file. You got to be another submission. So it depends on what kind of change. If the software is very critical and you're going to change that, so the FDA will say, okay, you probably this related design change, everything's kind of different. You need another file. So you need another submission. But if it's only like a simple thing, it's not related to the function or anything related to design, probably you can just file a letter to file and it should be okay internally.
This is one that I actually ran into in a company that I had worked with. And after that transition from development to production, and you set up your system, we had set up our system so it was very easy to go from Rev 1 to Rev 2 to Rev 3, and then you get to Rev A, and now I want to make a change to it. Well, how do I know what the controlled version that I was using? I can't rev it to B until that's approved and has gone through validation. So making sure that your system can keep control of development product even while you're running with a production rev that's out on the floor, I think is that you just need to make sure that your system can capture both of those so that you're in control. You know what software was getting validated prior to it getting moved to your Rev B.
And I can just add a little bit of color as far as the process you were talking about. It's really, it comes down to risk, and there are three things that you have to assess with any of those software changes. It's what's the effect on the verification that you've already performed? What's the effect on the validation that you've already performed? And then what's the effect on the risk assessment that you've already performed and submitted? And the content of your reaction to that what testing you have to do, ultimately what submission you're going to wind up making, and things of that nature come down to assessing those three silos.
And I'll just add one other thing, just as an observation of how we've answered this question, because it's interesting. I think Ashley kind of answered it from a regulatory perspective, and Derek answered it from a manufacturing perspective, and Chester answered it from a product development perspective, all three of which need to be analyzed at different points. So, I mean, if that's fair, I don't want to. So when you do that, to his point, you go through the design controls process again, at which point, if you're going to move forward, you're going to have to evaluate whether or not you need to do a letter to file or an updated 510K. And the work should be about the same. One's internal, one's external. And then you would do those manufacturing changes and controlling your revision or changing the things in the field. But did I miss anything? That's kind of just my overview. We can talk more if you want to talk some more at some point to any of these guys or whatever. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, I've been in that space a couple of times, actually, especially with the system, which has, things that are implanted, things that aren't, things of that nature. So basically, how it gets handled is on a case-by-case basis, and the systems are set up to consider all of those. And again, it's really risk-based. I mean, the new 14971 that came out basically said you have to apply it throughout the entire system. So having the structure and such set up in such a way, like in a EQMS, that has those rules laid out will basically drive you in the right direction. You only do what you basically have to do. So for those non-risky elements and such, you basically, if you do a CAPA or a nonconformance or a process validation or things of that nature, that's a business reason when it's not risk-based. So whatever's best for your business, you do what needs to be done. If you're into a situation where it is fit, form, or function with respect to risk to a human, then that's when you get into all the other requirements.
Anything to add, Derek? I saw you fiddling with the mic. I didn't know if...
Yeah, I mean, kind of going back to the different types of companies, it's the same thing. I would recommend either having different you can use the same quality system, but have different SOPs, or if you're going to have the same kind of overarching SOPs, have different work instructions for the groups. Making your non-regulated product have to go through the same hurdles as your regulated product is just going to be lost value. So, and you're probably not going to do a very good job at creating a SOP that can handle both at the same time. So don't do it. Create two separate work instructions. If you're in the non-regulated side, you've got a much simpler, straightforward work instruction that's focused on business interests rather than risk control. But then on your regulated side, have your work instructions that are focused on the risk control side.
Thank you so much. I think we're at time. I really appreciate you all for joining the panel, and thank you so much for the audience participation.